Welcome back to another fun episode of Thrive Live. Today, I'm very excited to have Dr. Heather Zwickey online today to talk with us about how hormones affect and dance with our immune system. Dr. Zwickey earned her PhD in immunology and microbiology from the University of Colorado Health Sciences with a focus on infectious disease and vaccine development. And she went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship and taught at Yale University School of Medicine. And she now works for National University of Natural Medicine, my alma mater. Go Nunham. And she launched the Healthcott Research Institute at Nunham and is currently co-leading NIH-funded clinical research programs. And to be honest, as long as I've known you, I feel like you've always been involved in NIH clinical research studies.
True, I have. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I think we're hitting a new level of studies right now. We've got so many studies going on. It's really fascinating.
That's great. That's awesome. How many, just as a total side tangent, how many studies are you involved in or NUNM, and do you have students involved in at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm primarily overseeing students and postdocs, and I currently have 6 postdocs and 15 students doing research projects, and all of them are different. So lots of new science coming out.
That's amazing. Love it. So let's dig into this topic. We were just talking about how excited we both are nerding out on this topic and how I think unrecognized it is as a clinician, seeing just that clinicians, I think, also under-recognize it. And I will admit, until you were talking at some of our continuing education seminars, I was like, oh yeah, I haven't been giving this connection much weight or thought space in my brain, but this whole connection between how our immune system is dancing with our hormones and how we feel it differently in men versus women, how we feel it differently in different phases of our hormonal life, and it's actually quite fascinating.
It is. And where it really came to light for me was during the pandemic, because here we had this situation where men and women are both being exposed to this virus. And, maybe people could tell that males handle viruses differently than females. As it turns out, females are much better at handling viral infections, whereas males are better at handling bacterial infections. So if you were partnered with a male and you saw him suffer more than you did, there was a real reason for that.
So let's dive a little bit deeper. What's the reason? Why do women handle infections differently than males? What's happening inside of us?
Yeah, so the first step of an infection is the virus or bacteria or other infectious agent like parasite has to get inside the cell. And as it turns out, there's differential expression of the receptors that viruses use to get inside a cell versus bacteria use. And women have more of the receptors for viruses. So these receptors are called TLR, so just initials. And these TLRs that bind to viruses are more highly expressed in women, whereas the TLRs that bind to bacteria are more highly expressed in men. So what that means is that women take up virus faster and they respond more quickly and more vigorously than men to a virus. Whereas for men, if you get a bacterial infection, so think of something like salmonella. Men are more likely to quickly pick up salmonella and respond to it as opposed to a virus like a flu or coronavirus. But it goes farther than that, because it's not just the virus getting inside, it's then the response once the virus is inside the cell. So we have a few different types of responses. Essentially, what your immune system does is it tailors the type of immune response that you're going to have to the type of pathogen that you encountered. So if you encounter a bacteria or virus, we mount a response, and we'll just call that response number 1. So it's called a Th1 response. If, on the other hand, you're responding to allergens or worms, you mount what we call a Th2 response. It's the second response. And then if you are responding to mold, as some of us have mold in our houses, that's called a Th17 response. And if you are really good at shutting down inflammation and shutting down responses, we call that a regulatory response, or a Treg response. So we've got Th1, bacteria and virus, Th2, worms and allergens, Th17 is mold. We also associate it with autoimmunity, and Treg is the response that we make to food, but it's also our suppressive immune response. And as it turns out, sex hormones are heavily involved in regulating these responses. So the Th1, the response to bacteria and virus, is strongly stimulated by estrogen. So women are going to have stronger Th1 responses. As it turns out, testosterone is really good at helping with the T regulatory response. So it helps suppress our immune system. And that means that males are going to be less good at responding to bacteria and viruses, but they are good at shutting things down. Now, there's an advantage to that in that at the end of any immune response, we want to shut things down, and males are way better at shutting things down than females are. Females tend to see things drag out for longer periods of time, but being able to shut things down has its cons as well. So we see men more prone to cancer, whereas women are more prone to autoimmune disease. Want to break it down a little further?
Oh, I love this. And I'm writing, I've got other burning questions whenever I don't want to like distract you from your awesome pathway that you're on. So,
okay. So now let's just think about during a woman's cycle. So a woman makes estrogen during her menstrual cycle. And if you think of day 1 as the menstrual cycle is the day you start your period, and then the middle of the cycle is the day that you ovulate. Estrogen goes up and then it starts to drop, and that's when you ovulate. And when you ovulate, estrogen starts to decrease, and now progesterone is going to go up. So as estrogen reaches its highest, if you are someone who has autoimmunity, that's when your immune system is most active, and that's when you would tend to flare for an autoimmune reaction. Whereas in the second half of your cycle, when progesterone goes up, that's associated with that second type of immune response, Th2. So we see allergies flare for women who have exposure to allergens during the second half of their cycle. So first half of the cycle, we would see a flare in autoimmunity. Second half of the cycle, you would see a flare in allergies. What does this mean? What it means
pause
is,
you for a minute.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, I know in school I was more trained to think that, you know, like the autoimmune, mostly Th1, but I feel like we also see, I feel like clinically I have seen autoimmune also be like Th17, and also some, and immunologically, I feel like it isn't quite, well, maybe you can explain it, but I feel like also some autoimmune that are more Th2.
Yeah. So,
or at least we're seeing those Th2 correlations, like with the progesterone and the cycle, the autoimmune flaring in the luteal phase, when really it's not supposed to be.
Yeah. So first of all, yes, Th17. So what we're seeing is Th1 is our systemic autoimmune response. Th7 is local to a site. So what you'll see is that the Th1 cytokine, which is the hormone of the immune system, interferon gamma, will circulate systemically when someone has an autoimmune disease. Whereas if we go to the site of the autoimmune disease, like the pancreas for diabetes, or the central nervous system for MS, or the skin for lupus and psoriasis, we'll actually see the Th17 at the site, the interferon gamma systemic. So both things are happening in an autoimmune reaction. Now, are there autoimmune reactions that are more Th2-like? There are autoimmune reactions that are mediated by T cells, and there are autoimmune reactions that are mediated by B cells. So if you're thinking more of a B cell mediated autoimmunity, so think about Graves' disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, Crohn's has both Th1 and Th2, but the ones that are antibody mediated, lupus, for example, can have more of a flare in a Th2 time because the antibodies are what increase during Th2 responses. And if antibodies are driving the pathology, so even during a Th1 autoimmunity, you might have phases of that autoimmune disease that are driven by antibodies as opposed to T cells, and then they'll get worse during the progesterone phase of the cycle. So, for example, when you're making antibodies and you're worried about antibodies clogging the kidneys for diabetes, you would worry more during the second half of the cycle. The first half of the cycle is going to drive more of the pathology for killing the pancreas. The second half is going to drive the pathology for increasing antibodies and clogging the kidneys. Does that make sense?
It does. You explained that beautifully.
Good. Cool.
I love it.
So what we also then observe is that when women get pregnant, we see if they have a Th1 based autoimmunity, so things like MS or diabetes, they go into remission, which is wonderful because pregnancy is shutting down that Th1 response. And if it doesn't, let's say that some Th1 escapes and you are having a Th1 response during pregnancy, then we tend to see preeclampsia show up because preeclampsia is associated with that Th1 response. If you have a healthy Th2 response during pregnancy, which shuts down autoimmunity, then the moment you give birth, now you start producing prolactin, which is going to drive the Th1 response again. And that's when women will tend to flare from an autoimmune reaction.
And yeah, just to pause you for a second, as a clinician, I'm on this with my autoimmune patients consistently because we don't want to I'm just saying this so if anyone's listening in your thought, your idea of when you're pregnant, we have 9 months, especially from where that Th1 autoimmune disposition, to work on those root triggers, the adrenal system, your sleep cycle, so that when you have that immune flip at delivery, it's more, hopefully it's more regulated. It's a little bit more tampered because we have 9 months to work on all these genetics and methylation and inflammation. And there's so much
regulatory cells. Yeah. So what I work on with folks during that period is also that increasing those T regulatory cells, because they're going to be what's able to suppress autoimmunity. And how do you work on that? Nutrition and sleep and all of the things that Dr. Abercrombie's working with you on. So absolutely, that is the best strategy to do during pregnancy.
I think I have no idea who said it. So I am going to be quoting someone without giving them the appropriate accolade, but whoever said it of you can't out supplement a shitty diet is so true.
It is true. No, and we're learning more and more about that, aren't we? And actually, that's really interesting because when we first started noticing these differences between men and women, and we were looking at infectious disease, we were like, wow, women really handle infectious disease better than men in most cases. And everybody hypothesized it was because women ate more salads. And I was like, it can't just be salads, because I know so many women who don't eat salads. But certainly there is a dietary difference that happens between males and females. And we know that's contributing to the immune system as well. Remember, they're co-localized, right? the microbiome that's responding to your diet is in your gut, and so is your immune system. So everything you eat is having an effect on your immune system. And we have to remember that, because I think sometimes it's easy for us to disconnect the two when they are integrally related.
And I have bring in one of my earlier questions from now, because I can see it forming for a lot of people, is talking about the immune response differing between men versus women.
Mhm.
Well, what about a correlation with how males versus females are able to fight intracellular viruses like Epstein-Barr, for instance?
Yeah.
Or
So
Lyme, or other things that are in this infectious world that are sticky and harder to treat.
here's the interesting part about that. Whereas when we look at that receptor that helps get the viruses and stuff inside, whereas men have less, what they have more of are CD8 T cells, which are the cells that are responsive to viruses. So for the viruses that are longer lived, like Epstein-Barr and herpes viruses and Lyme, males have more CD8 T cells, which are able to kill intracellular pathogens than females do. Where that switches is at menopause. When women go through menopause, if they don't go on hormone replacement therapy, then they flip. They have now more CD8 T cells and less B cells, whereas before menopause, women have more B cells and less CD8 T cells. So males are better able to fight off all of those intracellular infections pre-menopause, and post-menopause, women are just as good as males at fighting off those intracellular infections.
Do you see a shift with andropause, the menopause for men?
It has not been observed. It's a great question. It's they haven't done enough, probably enough people to see that. That being said, it's not that it hasn't been studied at all. It's just that it hasn't shown anything.
Yeah, interesting. That's fascinating with that menopause having that immune shift.
Oh, well, the other big thing that happens with menopause is that the inflammatory cytokines increase in women. So these are the cytokines, interleukin-1, interleukin-6, and TNF-alpha. And well, we think about them in terms of inflammation. And so we think about chronic inflammatory diseases really hitting women, both as they're going through perimenopause and then into menopause. The other thing that's associated with those are the sickness behaviors. So with interleukin-1, you get malaise and fatigue and some depression. And remember, that's showing up perimenopause and into menopause. So if you start feeling that feeling of like, oh God, I don't feel like I can get out of bed today, that could just be some inflammation happening. It's very common as you go through that hormone flip. The other
pause you for a minute. Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I just want to do a little plug, because literally last week on Thrive Live, I just talked about the 30s and 30s, 40s, 30s and 40s. I called it the forgotten chapter of hormones in women, because we're so focused on like PMS and fertility and pregnancy and menopause. And we could have 20 years perimenopause, right? And
absolutely.
And that's where we're seeing all these subtle shifts. And I think what you just highlighted about we're starting to see that inflammatory immune shift. And
it was interesting. I was chatting with a friend of mine, and she's like, I couldn't figure out if I was developing depression. And then I heard you talk about hormone changes and the increase in interleukin-1. And I thought, I'm not developing depression. I just have some inflammation. And so I took some lemon balm and I feel fine. And I was like, oh, good. You didn't have to go on an antidepressant. You just had to reduce some of your inflammation. And I think that's a common occurrence where women start to think like, oh, what's happening? Like another friend of mine. So let's keep going with the inflammatory cytokines and the sickness behaviors, because interleukin-6, which is our second inflammatory cytokine, causes anxiety. So I was talking with another friend of mine this week. We were having breakfast, and she's become a long distance runner. And she's like, I was running last week, and when I say long distance, she was past 22 miles at that point. And she's like, and I started to catastrophize. I started to go, oh my gosh, I'm going to get hit by a car and I'm going to be laying in a ditch and nobody's going to find me. And then I realized, hey, this is anxiety. This is interleukin-6. I've run long enough that I'm causing inflammation. And this is just my body responding to the inflammation. I'm not really going to, get hit by a car. And it calms you down to know that it's just a physiological response. And you don't have to catastrophize about this, that, or the other. And that's so important in perimenopause, because that's the whole window where many of us are raising kids and we're starting to catastrophize about our children, and we're catastrophizing about our job and about our commute and, this, that, and the other. And it's IL-6. And so it just means there's some inflammation that's happening in you because of your hormone cycle, and you control the inflammation, you'll control the anxiety. You don't need to go on anti-anxiolytic medications. You just need to control the inflammation. And then the last one is TNF alpha, and that is a lovely cytokine that causes aggression and hostility. So when you feel like you can't control your temper, again, it could just be an inflammatory cytokine. It may just be that you're making TNF alpha.
I'm going to pause you for a minute because I have a totally tangent on
Great.
this.
I love
Inflammatory perimenopause. So I'm a big proponent of mental health. I'm open now that I am in, I've been in weekly therapy, counseling. She's also my business coach because it's all interrelated, for years. But I just met with her this morning and we were talking about this specifically of the social norms of perimenopause. What were our older generations doing? They were pushing through it. They were going to, going on antidepressants, going on anti-anxiety meds, which again, I'm a believer and there's a time and place for everything. And if you need it, it's a big support network. And this is also, why all the weight loss, slim fast, everything came out of the perimenopause demands of inflammation and body changes and body dysmorphia and mood changes and emotional changes. And we were talking about just about how that was our role model, right? What's our role model for perimenopause is that trying to just push through it without really investigating why, like just sitting at like, why do I feel inflamed? Why is this happening? And the exciting thing is, I think there's been a big shift in the mental health space, huge in the last, 30 years.
Yeah.
And I think that the newer generations are definitely challenging these old narratives that we have about health and how we approach health. And I think that it's the exciting time right now, at least in healthcare, and with so much interest in holistic, natural, integrative health sphere, is that we can change this narrative of perimenopause to, instead of just to fight it and push through it and just to be a bull and push through it, we can take a step back and just say, yeah, I'm feeling depressed. I'm feeling anxious. My body aches. I feel inflamed.
Yep. And
take a different course.
Perfectly legitimate. It happens, right? As these hormone changes shift, it happens. And we can also control it in different ways. So now that we're recognizing, so let's take interleukin-6, which is that IL-6 anxiety relationship. It turns out that, making IL-6 is absolutely normal. And it's a bidirectional relationship. So if you can start to get a handle on your anxiety mentally, where you go, okay, I'm going to do some mindfulness, I'm going to do a meditation, I'm going to think of puppies or things that make me happy and try to reduce that anxiety, guess what? The IL-6 goes down. So bidirectional relationship. When you feel anxious, your IL-6 goes up. When you feel less anxious, your IL-6 goes down. But if you have inflammation, if you can control the mental emotional piece, you can bring that inflammation down with a mind-body practice. It takes a lot of practice though, right? So that's
fascinating, because I was wondering this last week. I was like, what is the exact connection? I don't know. I know it's there.
Yeah,
Like, why do I feel so much better after meditating? And
there it
yep.
is. Yeah, it's absolutely there. And it's interesting as well. We see during the pandemic, different people turned to different substances to try to control their anxiety. So we saw alcohol consumption increase, and we saw cannabis consumption increase. And interestingly, they have opposite effects on those pro-inflammatory cytokines. So alcohol consumption will increase the IL-1, the IL-6, and the TNF alpha. Cannabis consumption actually decreases the IL-1, the IL-6, and the TNF alpha. So the folks who started using alcohol in much higher levels were actually just increasing their anxiety. They felt a little bit more relaxed because alcohol is a suppressant overall, but their inflammation increased. Whereas the folks who turned to cannabis actually got a little happier. It's like
A little less
understand
inflamed.
mechanistically what was happening here because you were controlling your inflammation. So it's really interesting to watch what people are naturally gravitating to, and whether or not those things that you naturally gravitate to are actually beneficial, or whether they continue to feed this cycle that you are in.
So speaking of feeding that cycle, I'm sure you probably have a list of things on top of your head that drive interleukin 6.
That increase it?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Of course. So
I know who I'm talking to.
yeah. So
So what's your top 5? Top 5 things that drive interleukin 6 that will drive that inflammation?
So the number one thing is food. And food can do it in a few different ways. There are foods that are absolutely inflammatory. So things like trans fats, or, and when I say trans fats, a lot of people think, oh, French fries. No, trans fats are the things that make baked goods continue to be soft when they're on the grocery store shelf for a long period of time. So here you're talking about things like crackers and cookies and those sorts of things. But trans fats and advanced glycosylation end products, AGEs, so people who like a good char on their steak, those will automatically drive IL-6 production. But then also with food, we have a lot of people who eat things that are not good for them, and they may or may not recognize that they have a hypersensitivity to that food. So eating foods that you should not be eating because your body does not respond well to them is a second way food does it. And then the third thing is overeating. So just being overweight, it turns out that there are cells in your fat that will produce these cytokines. So the more overweight you are, the more you're going to have high IL-6. And we know weight loss decreases IL-6. So food is the number one thing. Second thing for driving inflammation is stress. And there's really, really good evidence showing that when our stress increases and then stays high, like we are designed to have a stress response and then go back to normal, and have a stress response and then go back to normal. But when we have sustained stress over a long period of time, we shut down those regulatory cells that allow then our immune system to go haywire. So stress is definitely number 2. Underlying infections, which is where a lot of people think that their inflammation is coming from, is actually probably closer to number 5, except for number 3, which is gum disease. So there was actually—
Wouldn't have thought about that.
Right? Most people don't. But
Nope.
it turns out it was the cardiologist who discovered, so IL-6, in addition to be causing anxiety, can cause heart disease. So cardiologists went looking for, well, why do people have so much IL-6? And it's from not flossing. And so the number one link for cardiovascular disease is lack of flossing and people having gum disease. And remember, that's an infection, and it's often a constant infection. And we forget to ask our patients, hey, when's the last time you saw a dentist? So it turns out that's number 3. So we've got food, we've got stress, we've got gum disease. The fourth thing is exposure to chemicals in our environment. And And then the fifth thing is an infection. So things like Epstein-Barr or Lyme or parasites or whatever. But the chemicals in the environment is a really interesting thing, because I think, back in the 60s and 70s, it was always better living through chemistry. And now what we're learning is so many of those chemicals are killing off microbes in our microbiome. And those microbes are interacting with our immune system. And if they're unhappy, then our immune system is unhappy, and our immune system starts producing inflammation. So that includes diesel in the air, so air pollution. It includes smoke in the air. Like, I was chatting with my mom this morning, who's in Minnesota, and she can't walk outside her front door, right? Like, wood fire smoke is a pollutant, but it also has a huge effect on your immune system, and it will cause inflammation. But it also includes things like dryer sheets. It includes chemicals that people are putting on their head. Remember that your hair follicles on the top of your head are the largest follicles, and most absorption is going to happen here. So if you're not using an organic shampoo and conditioner, if you're dyeing your hair lots of different colors, all of that stuff is going in, and it is causing inflammation. And lotions. Yeah, there's so many things out there that people are using, that our immune system is like, wait, that's foreign. What are you doing? And that triggers an inflammatory reaction. So there they are, the top five.
You just made my, I will give you credit, but my five-step program.
Yeah. Is it there? Awesome. We didn't even plan this, folks.
I know we didn't, but I mean, it's so true. I mean, you think about how many disease processes, dementia, Alzheimer's, clotting, strokes, plaque buildup, chronic fatigue. Can we halt, redirect, reverse, start to repair if we can get that inflammation down?
That's exactly right. And I didn't mention sleep, because it's really lack of sleep that is leading to inflammation. When you sleep an 8-hour night, it resets those cytokines. But if you're not sleeping through the night, then you're not getting that advantage of that reset. So at that point, you've got to figure out, why are you not sleeping? Because your body really needs that reset.
And a lot of the other points, the other 5 points we were talking about, I don't know about the gum disease, but I'm sure there's a connection there, can all disrupt your sleep. Epstein-Barr, Lyme disease are neuroinflammatory aspects. The stress, the high cortisol will not allow you to release the melatonin. If you're having inflammatory food, eating too late, close to bedtime. Anyways, and it's that vicious cycle of, what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that whole thing of, where do you start? I think that a lot of times when people come into a natural medicine world, they're like completely overwhelmed, because we want to change everything. Because there's this question of, where do you want to start? We got to start somewhere, and then we have to layer until we can get rid of this inflammation, and finally we have health. So yeah.
One step at a time. Go for the biggest elephant in the room, and then the elephants will start to shrink because it's this whole circle thing. So as you get, and I love that you went to food number one, going back to the original quote, you can't out supplement a shitty diet. It's just, I mean, the supplements are there to help speed things up, but at the end of the day, you can't out supplement a shitty diet.
Well, and I think about it, like, with my family, I use the car analogy all the time. Like, I don't care how beautiful your car is, if you've got your Porsche and it's in perfect condition, but if you don't put the right fuel in it, that thing is not going to go down the road. So you've got to pay attention to that first.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I want to take a quick moment to talk about the hot topic of, how does the immune system affect intimacy and sexual activity?
So great question. It is a hot topic. The immune system is heavily involved in our sex lives, and you wouldn't think it is, but remember that sex is for reproduction, and remember that your immune system is designed to respond to anything that's foreign. And to a person with a uterus, sperm is foreign. So your immune system is designed to respond to sperm. So we had to create, or our bodies had to create, or God had to create, if that's your belief, a way to not reject sperm. And it does it it's really clever. So there's a hormone called oxytocin, and many people have heard of oxytocin because it's how mamas and babies bond to each other. But it turns out that males and females are making oxytocin during a sexual encounter, but they make it at different times. So males make oxytocin when they are visually stimulated by a female, and that bonds them to that female. It's not a huge amount of oxytocin, but it's enough for them to feel that sense of attraction and pursue that female. Females make oxytocin when they orgasm. And what's interesting is that the oxytocin burst when you orgasm is immunosuppressive. It shuts down a Th1 response so that you do not mount an immune response to sperm. Otherwise, you would reject sperm and you would not be able to get pregnant.
So orgasming improves your pregnancy rates.
That's exactly right. And it's, again, one of those conversations that physicians don't often have with their patients. If the woman is not orgasming, it's highly likely that she is not going to be able to get pregnant because she's rejecting sperm. And one of the things we see with people who are having infertility problems is that the woman has started mounting an immune response against her partner's sperm such that she can't get pregnant because she's not orgasming. So here, this is where we get to promote good orgasms for everyone. Now, I often get asked the question of, does this work if you're in a same-sex relationship? It does. If you're a female orgasming with another female, you still are immunosuppressed post-orgasm. So that is when you are at higher risk of infection too. So keep that in mind. And if you're male orgasming with another male, or you're a male who spots another male that you're attracted to, that's when you're going to get that oxytocin release. The other thing that oxytocin is doing, of course, when you orgasm is it's bonding you to this other person. So if a woman orgasms with someone else, she's going to feel that sense of attachment to them, which is protective, right? So this is how we paired up so that a woman was protected during her time of pregnancy. So interesting, hormonally, women are immunosuppressed for about 24 hours post-orgasm.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a long time, right?
I like jaw drop. Like, I don't think I quite realized the importance of the orgasm from the immune association here before.
I know. So many people don't. That's why it's a hot topic.
Yeah. I love it. More orgasms. The world would be a better place with more orgasms.
That's right. Everyone would feel happier.
Less conflict.
Totally. But, oxytocin is so interesting. And I love teaching people about oxytocin because we also call it the hug hormone, because you have oxytocin receptors on your back. So when someone hugs you, you're going to stimulate oxytocin production in that person who's being hugged. So can you guess where your dog's oxytocin receptors are?
Right on the back? No, where you scratch?
Belly,
of course. I haven't had a puppy in the years. So I'm like, where'd you scratch a puppy?
Scratch the belly. And the dog is like, I'm friends for life. Yep.
Makes sense.
Totally.
That is very cool. Well, I'm just looking at time. Is there anything else that you want to impart as a takeaway? I mean, I've loved everything that we've talked about. I think it's been huge, especially because this is a completely, I think, not unrecognized, but it's not talked about enough. Under-recognized. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just say that, if we had been really doing personalized medicine during the pandemic, we would have timed vaccines to a woman's cycle. We know that when you get the best immune response is when estrogen is the highest. So you would want to do it right before ovulation. Whereas if you're worried about side effects from a vaccine, then you want to do it in the second half of your cycle when estrogen is lowest, and preferably right before you start menstruating. And if we did that, we would see a lot less of the side effects that we were seeing with folks who were like, why did my friend have a terrible reaction to that vaccine? And how come I was just fine, didn't have any reaction at all? A lot of that has to do with our hormone cycles and our microbiome and how our immune system is designed to respond. And so I think that it allows us, if we start taking to some of these other things into account, it allows us to individualize our experiences.
That makes complete sense. And you're right. And I think that also moving forward, we can use that information for any vaccine.
Oh, absolutely. And then you overlay the estrogen and sex hormone response with the cortisol response. And so you say, if I want a really strong reaction to a vaccine, I want to do it later in the day when cortisol is low. Whereas if I want to minimize my side effects, I want to do it early in the day when cortisol is high. And when we start doing that, we allow people to choose, like, are you more concerned that you have a vigorous response to this, or are you more concerned that you don't have a reaction because you're prone to autoimmunity? You know, there's so many things that we can do when we understand the intricacies of the system.
I'm just processing.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, I was like, wow, yeah, I think that's such powerful information.
I just wanted to get out there so that people feel empowered.
Me too. So I'm hoping that I can get your message out there.
Great.
Spread the word of this. So then people can go and ask educated or more educated questions, ask those deeper questions to their primary care provider and get the deeper, better conversations that they're looking for.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for hopping on today. We're so appreciative of you coming on. For everyone who's listening, next week we have Dr. Freddie Utralde, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He's an interventional cardiologist. Earbuds falling out. And he's going to be talking about holistic integrative cardiovascular medicine.
Awesome.
He's deep in the research arena of cardiology as well.
Cool.
So cool. Well, thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.